Okay, so welcome everybody to Vibe. This is our first event this year, in fact, due to obvious reasons. We're proud to present today Moi Wo's own, Wang Tong's own, and Larry Feign. Quite a few years in the writing, The Flower Boat Girl, and he's going to do a presentation for us all now. We're going to go out on Facebook Live, so we've got a couple of cameras, one up there and one here, and we're going to flip between those for the broadcast. The presentation is going to be around 40 minutes, and then we're going to have about 20 minutes of questions. And so think up those questions. And I think that's about it, really. So over to Larry.
Okay, thank you very much. I really appreciate everyone coming, my fellow Lantau residents, I guess. So I want to invite you into the world of this amazing woman who was, as many people know, she was a prostitute who lived a hard life and eventually became the most powerful pirate in history. And not a lot of people are aware of this, and so I was instantly attracted to the story when I met her. So, coming into her windswept world, let's talk about who was she. Let's start with her name. Is this working? Yeah, there we go. Okay, if you do a search for the Chinese pirate woman, you'll come up with a lot of stories about Zheng Yisao or Xu Yang, but that's not what she was actually called. This is how you would write her name, but she was a boat person from Guangdong province, and she spoke Cantonese, or the boat people's dialect of Cantonese, and would not have spoken Putonghua, which is what the name Zheng Yisao is. So in the book, I've made sure to use the Cantonese names, which is Cheng Yat So. I don't know if I'm pronouncing the tones right, or Shek Yang or Shek Yang, either way you want to pronounce it, but I've seen both. She was a boat person. She was the daughter of a fisherman, from what I can tell. And as part of the boat people community, the Tanka, as they were derogatively called, were, at the time, we're talking early 19th century, at that time, they were the untouchable class in China. They were the only class of people in all of China who were forbidden to get an education, forbidden to get government civil service jobs. They were stuck in their world of ships and boats and fishing and sea transport. And so they were poor people. And so what happened to her, from what we know, is that she ended up working on a flower boat. The flower boats were like this. They were barges that were set up as floating entertainment centers. And they were found in the waterways of every major city in China. But the most famous ones of all were in Guangzhou. They were anchored right offshore in the middle of the city. This one isn't necessarily in the middle of the city, but this is Guangzhou from around 1880, this photograph. And so the gentlemen clients would come aboard the boat, and there would be a reception room where they would be served drinks, and beautifully clad young women would play music, and eventually they would go into these curtained off cubicles and engage in other forms of entertainment. We know that Yang, that's what I'm going to call her, worked on one of the flower boats, and it's reasonable to assume that she was sold there. It seems quite unlikely that a girl of 13 years old would voluntarily run away from home to work on one of these. And like I said, the boat people were very poor. And so I've found numerous accounts of people selling their daughters out of desperation. And what better place to sell them than to a place like this? She was then, later, around age 26. I should mention the years here. She was born in 1775. So we're talking 1801. She was 26 years old, and she was kidnapped by a pirate gang in a ship that looked probably like the one on the right. Where she was abducted from, we don't know for sure. Unlikely she was taken straight off one of the flower boats. The pirates would not have sailed upriver right into the center of town. And they wouldn't have wanted to jeopardize their clients because they were, of course, in the business of trafficking young women too. So the reason I showed both these ships is because in the first chapter of the book, she sees this boat coming into the bay, and she sees this elongated eyes on the front of the boat, and that's her first sense that there's something wrong. These eyes on ships, that they're called oculi, were a tradition in parts of China, and you could kind of tell where a boat came from and what its purpose was by looking at the eyes. So the ones that you're most familiar in this region were round eyes like this. If it had round eyes, it was from Fujian province or farther north all the way up to Shanghai. If they were centered or looking forward, that meant that the boat was a cargo vessel looking forward to help chart a course to where they were going. Some of them had eyes looking downward. Those were fishing boats, because those eyes looking downward were searching for fish or trying to scare off whales and other competitors for the fish. So round eyes meant from Fujian and north. This region, for some reason, they didn't have a tradition of oculi on ships. But some of them, with the elongated eyes, were associated with the south and west, along the border with Vietnam and along the North Vietnamese coast. And so in the book, she sees this boat with elongated eyes. The reason for that is that the pirates who kidnapped her had recently been hired as a mercenary navy by the Vietnamese, or the Annamese. It was called Annam at the time instead of Vietnam. The Annamese government there was a civil war going on. So the Annamese government hired Chinese pirates as a mercenary army. They had a saying that the Vietnamese make great ships but terrible sailors. And so for about 13 years, these pirates had been fighting as a mercenary navy in Annam. And when the fighting died down, they came back to China and most likely kept these beautiful mahogany ships. And so that's why my speculation is that they sailed in a ship with the elongated eyes like that. Now, when they abducted people, this was one of the pirates' ways of operating. They would come into coastal villages and they would come on shore and raid the village. They would go into shops and steal food items. They'd take rice, they'd take chickens and pigs and vegetables. But they would also gather as many women and young boys as they could, bring them out to the boats, and then take them offshore just far enough that they couldn't swim to safety and where they could guard against anyone trying to rescue them. The young boys often were kept as kind of involuntary pirates, but the women were ransomed off. And so what they would do is wait for the families to come and offer money or food or goods to get their women back. So someone's wife, mother, daughter was being held for ransom. But some of them couldn't get ransomed. They might have been from a family too poor to pay a ransom, or maybe they just didn't want to, or maybe it was a young woman working on her own and didn't have anyone to ransom her. With those women, what then would happen is typically the captain would then hold an auction to sell these women as wives to his own crew. You have to understand that in Chinese maritime culture, it wasn't like in the West where women aren't aboard ships. These were boat people. Their whole lives, their homes were on the ships. So women lived and worked aboard. Whole families lived and worked aboard the ships, including the pirate ships. And some of these young men might not have had wives, and so this was how they would get them. They'd get these unransomed women. But, as you might expect, the captain would often pick off the most attractive ones for himself. And this is what it seems happened with Yang. Here she was, an ex-prostitute who likely didn't have a family left back in her home village or whatever village she had settled in. Either that, or maybe she wasn't worth ransoming. She wasn't marriageable with that kind of past. But there was something special about her that made the captain attracted to her. And so it seems kind of cliche writing a book like this to say, oh, she must have been very beautiful. But I think she probably was. She was probably very attractive and had something else about her, some other kind of charisma that drew the captain to select her. This Captain Cheung Yat. So it makes us wonder, what did she look like? Now, if you do a search for her online, 9 times out of 10, you'll see this picture. And people say, that's her. That's an etching of Cheung Yat, or Cheung Yi Sao, as she's normally referred to. I'll tell you why this couldn't be. First of all, she's holding a European rapier. She's not holding a Chinese sword. This little scholar's cap on her head, I don't know what that's doing there. This style of kind of form-fitting Cheongsam type kind of top didn't come into fashion until the beginning of the 20th century. And we're talking 1801 right now. So whoever put this image together was not so much interested in historical accuracy as he was in making an attractive Asian woman look badass. And so this is another picture that often comes up if you do searches for her, and I don't know what to say about that. She looks like a cross between Joan of Arc with the chainmail and an Amazon fighter. And so the fact is, there were no cameras in 1801. The first cameras in this region came in 1850, and she had long retired by then. And there's no known drawings of her posing for any picture. What she more likely looked like was like this. These are photos and an etching from around 1880, but things hadn't really changed in hundreds of years. So these were boat women. So you can see they wore these kind of loose-fitting tunics, like in the left picture and in the middle one. And very often, there's a lot of paintings of boat women that were done by George Chinnery, a painter who lived in Macau at the time. And he painted a lot of boat girls, and they all had this head covering. So that seemed to be a very standard thing for most of them. Or they'd have the woven hats. And you can see the hairstyle's very simple. This one on the right is an etching done by some European travelers in 1880, who wrote a travelogue book of a boat woman. And what's notable about her is the dress. She obviously had posed for them in her best outfit. And you can see it's a little bit more formal looking with the collar and everything, and even the headdress seems to be a more formal kind of cut. And that kind of corresponds with a lot of photos I've seen of wealthy Cantonese women from that period. And so it does seem that boat women also, when they wanted to dress up nice, they would wear something like that. And that became the basis for the outfit that she's wearing on the cover of my book. So now when she was abducted in 1801, just a few months earlier, another person had been abducted who later became a very important part of her life. And he's very familiarly known in Hong Kong as Cheung Po Tsai. Cheung Po Tsai the story was he was out fishing with his father, and the pirates came and grabbed them both. We don't know what happened to his father, but Cheung Po Tsai was 14 at the time, and he was adopted right away as the captain's protege. And this is another interesting part about the Chinese boat people history. Traditionally, a captain of rank would often select a young boy to become his apprentice, that he would train to eventually become a captain in his own right, but also, beyond being his apprentice, become his bed partner. It was very normal. It wasn't that they were necessarily homosexual by choice, but it was almost like a a status thing. If you were a captain of a certain rank, you had to have a young boy, a catamite, which is a term for a male concubine. And so Cheung Po Tsai was the catamite of Cheng Yat the pirate. And he was later adopted as Cheng Yat's adopted son. And he was groomed to become a leader. So this young boy was very, he had a lot of charisma. He was very flamboyant. And there's a lot of legends about him. And there's even movies. Oh, wait a minute. I skipped something, didn't I? Oh. Well, I don't know what happened to him. Yeah, that shouldn't have been there. But let me just go forward. There he is. So if you look at writings about these Chinese pirates from around that time, and even up until today, a lot of the focus on Cheung Po Tsai. That's the name of this movie. It's a production done by TVB in, I think, 2014 or something like that. And all the focus is on him as the leader of the pirates. As I've told you, this woman Yang, she became eventually the leader of all the pirates in the South China coast. But quite often he's given the credit because he's a man. He was also the flamboyant front man. He would dress in purple robes and he had this flashy turban on his head. And he was apparently a very outgoing and flamboyant character to begin with, where she was more the brains behind the operation. But in the book it tells how their relationship developed and what happened between them. But then you get a movie like this, which is basically a science fiction movie about a policewoman on Zheng Chao who goes back in time to find Cheung Po Tsai to get him to help her solve some kind of mystery. This brings up, another interesting point, that there wasn't much written about these pirates. So when I first started researching this book, it was a challenge to find things. In the West, pirates have been romanticized for hundreds of years, ever since Jonathan Swift started writing about them in the 17th century. There was this idea of these colorful outlaws that, that had certain things, admirable traits about them. And that spawned a lot of legends about pirates. But in this part of the world, the pirates were just regarded as criminals and nothing more. So there was no reason for people to write stories about them, to make up legends. Most of the information we get about them is from magistrates' records from when they were arrested. And so it became a real challenge for me to get any information about them. So in my initial research, I'm finding what you would probably find if you do a search online. And it intrigued me, all these stories about her. There were stories about how she was taken by this pirate captain, dragged right into his cabin, and the first thing she did was whack him across the face and demand a 50-50 share in his outfit and a 50% control in the pirates if he wanted her as wife. It sounds very dramatic, but it just didn't seem right to me. And I smelled something wrong. Now, I'll tell you a little about my background. Most people know me as a cartoonist, but actually my undergraduate degree is in history. And my original ambition was to write historical fiction. And I studied under an accomplished historian who taught me about historical research. And one of the most important things he taught me was how to smell bullshit. And then how to figure out how much truth there is in a story. And I'm not going to get into those methods, it would take me too long. But I smelled some bullshit here. And so I looked deeper into the sources of all these stories I was reading, and what it boiled down to was, like I said, no one had written anything about the pirates. There were a few first-hand accounts of pirates from some British sailors that were limited to some incidents, but there was no history of them until in 1830, a Chinese civil servant who'd been posted to Guangzhou was kind of an amateur historian himself, and he wrote a history of the pirates who operated in that area from around 1790 to 1810. He wrote this in 1830. He didn't have any first-hand sources, but and he wrote this with a certain agenda. And so I actually was able to fact check a lot of the things that he wrote in there, and he got the dates right, and the basic incidents that happened he got right. But in between, the things he didn't know, he filled in with conversations, meetings, all sorts of things that he could not possibly have been privy to. And no one that he would have known would have been able to be privy to these things. But he wrote them into this so-called history of the pirates. And he also made it clear throughout this whole thing that his agenda was to present the bravery of the Chinese Navy in defeating these pirates. And he made that point again and again and again. And then this was translated into English by a German missionary. And that became the authoritative source about these pirates. And it didn't really get much attention until around the 1920s. Two things. The Argentinian author, what's his name, Borges, I don't remember his first name. Anyway, he wrote a short story about this pirate queen based on some of the things that he'd read in this 1830s account, but he was writing it as fiction. And then in 1926, it caught the attention of this American journalist named Joseph Gollum. He was a journalist who liked to write pop history articles about different interesting historical facts. So in 1926, he wrote an article for this pulp magazine called Mrs. Ching Goes A-Pirating. And he doesn't even cite this 1830s document as his source. He starts right at the beginning saying that his source was his local Chinese laundryman, which kind of made me think, maybe there's some suspicion to, the veracity of his story. And he went on, he's the one who invented this myth of Cheng Yat, brought her into his cabin and she slapped him and stood up to him and said, I want half of everything. And he agreed, and then she helped to make the pirates this big, powerful force. And this when he then compiled a bunch of his little historical essays into a book. They weren't all about pirates, or it was just a book of historical nuggets. That book became very popular, became a hit, and so this story about her started to circulate in America and elsewhere. And this became the definitive source of what we know about Cheng Yat-so. Even to this day, much of what you'll find if you see articles in magazines or on websites and so on about her, first they'll have that picture of her, which couldn't possibly be her, and then they'll have kind of a summary of what this guy wrote about, where he took that 1830s document and added his own dialogue and his own kind of swashbuckling adventure scenes. And from there, he made it very dramatic. It would have made a great movie, and then it did. In 2003, this is the French poster. It was an Italian movie called Singing Behind Screens. And it was supposedly based on this original 1830s account of her. But what they did, see this guy with the beard? He's one of 3 Italian sailors that the director placed on board. And it was the Italians advising the Chinese pirates what to do. And she, the ostensible leader, she was a Japanese who grew up in Italy so she could speak Italian. Her role in the movie was to stand on the upper deck posing with a sword, and then to go into the cabin and find some excuse to take her clothes off. And so that was essentially her role in leading the pirate fleet. And then the popular image of her got even more exaggerated when the third Pirates of the Caribbean movie came out And this character was supposedly based on her. And I mean, of course, you don't expect Pirates of the Caribbean to be about historical truth, but it just kind of perpetuated this idea of her as just this cartoon character kind of lady pirate image. So everything was so far-fetched, but there was something about her that just fascinated me, and I was hooked. And I used to complain to my wife there, saying, God, I wish there was a book about her. And she finally said, shut up about you wish there was a book about her. Why don't you write the book? And so, with her support and encouragement, then I started really researching this on a full-time basis. Well, not full-time, but on a very serious basis. So fortunately, I came across some textbooks. Come on, let's go. Yeah. So fortunately, this woman, Diane Murray, had done. She was an American academic who studied in Taiwan, and she did a groundbreaking study about these particular pirates. And she did all the research, finding all these old magistrates' records and rare documents, and she practically lived in the British Library getting old records from British sailors about their encounters and so on. In any case, she wrote this as a PhD dissertation and then expanded it in a book, which is long out of circulation, from the 1980s. Her research was followed up by Professor Robert Anthony, who used to be a professor of history at the University of Macau. And he also has his book about the pirates. And these were really valuable to me because they went into great detail about many of the events, about the technology, about a lot of the sociological aspects of what was going on. But to my great frustration, neither of them was interested in the people, the individual characters. There wasn't much focus on the personalities involved. It was all very academic. And so still, now I had more information and a lot of holes in the story. But by this point, I'd given up the idea, maybe I'll write a biography of this woman, because there wasn't enough. I only found maybe 3 eyewitness accounts of her. None of them even described what she looked like, and they were very brief. But the story had me hooked, and so I wanted to figure out who she was and tell this story, and I decided it had to be as a novel because that was the only way I could really explore her character, but to stick to the truth, not like these earlier versions where you make up history and exaggerate everything. And so I started putting together the pieces of a puzzle. And let me see. This picture has nothing to do with anything, but it's one of the photos that helped inspire me while I was writing. It's by a photographer named Fan Ho, who took a lot of pictures in the 1960s. And he had these beautiful images of, of boat people in different areas of Hong Kong. But there was, I'll tell you one incident that really kind of made me understand my mission of what I was doing. So she was kidnapped in 1801. In October of that year, the things I'm going to tell you were verified facts that came from the historical record. In October of that year, the pirates were seen gathering behind this island near the port of Tien Bak or Dien Bai on the western Guangdong coast. And they were gathered there clearly preparing to raid this port and to hijack some barges that were carrying salt, which was a very valuable commodity at the time. And the pirates were in the habit of hijacking these and taking the salt. And so we know that from one account. Then from another account, there's description of a weather incident. I don't want to give it away and spoil it for you if you haven't read this book. A weather incident which wrecked many ships. And then the following day, some people from shore, some vigilantes, came out and took advantage of the situation and attacked these pirates who had been planning to attack their port. And a lot of lives were lost and a lot of ships were wrecked. Well, I looked up the date, and none of these reports point out that this was on the day of the Moon Festival. And so, putting together a picture, these pirates had gathered outside of this port on the evening of the Moon Festival, and that night they had this weather incident, and the next morning the ships were destroyed, and they never did raid the port. Then, according to one account that I read, 6 weeks later, Yang and Cheng Yat were formally married. So, putting these two things together, it immediately made me wonder. Okay, first of all, she'd been kidnapped. She was taken as the pirate leader's wife. And yet here, many, many months later, there's a formal wedding. Now, whose idea was that? It's unlikely it was his idea. He'd already taken her. What else does he need to do? So maybe like a lot of women who kind of dream of a fancy wedding, maybe that's what she wanted. But whether or not that's what she wanted or not, it clearly indicates by this point she was willing and committed to being with the pirates. Now, the reason I bring up the issue with the port is that this happened in between her abduction and this wedding. And in my mind, it struck me there must have been a turning point that made her change her mind and made her decide to give herself up to him and to the pirates and to formally join them and to do so through a wedding. And so I don't know what happened. I don't know what that turning point was. But as I sat there, and sometimes I'd sit for full days without writing a word, just kind of meditating on these things. And it gave me some ideas into her character of things that might have happened to change her mind and make her into a real person who was facing a certain kind of situation and dilemma in her life and how she solved it. Because from that point on, she started insinuating herself into the business of the pirates, and she became more of the brains behind the operation. But I'm getting ahead of myself. And then I'll tell you another little anecdote. This is something that I discovered that the historians had never really put together. In one of those academic books that I just showed before, there was one mention in a footnote at the back of the book that the pirates had been, I think I have to back up to this map that is out of order here. Couple more. The pirates had been spotted at the entrance to a river. Oh, I guess I'm going way too far, but I wanted you to see the map. It's right before this. Okay, so these maps are in the book. This one on the left is the Pearl River Delta at the time. And you can see Omun, which is Macau, and then there's Dayushan, Lantau, Hong Kong Island, which didn't really figure into the story. And this was their main base of operation. But they also roamed down the Vietnamese coast as far as here to the Spirit River. So what happened is also it was in 1802, the pirates were then recruited yet again to join, to form a mercenary navy, again to fight on the side of the enemy's imperial government against a new uprising in the south. And so we know that they were in that area in Vietnam and that they were based in this border town called Trang Pinh, Quang Binh, something like that in Vietnamese. And that's all that we knew until I saw this footnote that they were spotted outside the Spirit River on such and such date. So again, I put a lot of things together. I looked up that date for one thing, and the date was 2 days before Chinese New Year, also known as Tet in Vietnam. And then there was nothing else I could find until I went to some Vietnamese sources. And I can't read Vietnamese, so I was limited to English translations. But then I found, through some of these sources, that actually there was a big battle at the Spirit River. What had happened was the armies and the navies of the, the government side had gathered there, and they had a Chinese New Year banquet that was thrown for them by the emperor. He was a boy emperor. He was only 19 years old at the time. So he was there, along with a very interesting general, the top general of the enemy's army, who that's one of the big surprises in the book, so I'm not going to mention who that was. This general and the emperor were both there. And they threw this Chinese New Year banquet. And that evening there was a surprise attack by the rebel forces that just decimated the government army and destroyed a lot of ships. So based on that, I put together a picture of what may have happened. So obviously the pirates had been sent to this area to prepare for an invasion to go further south into Hui, the ancient capital. And I was thinking of Yang. How did she feel? So here was this woman who was born into poverty, was a prostitute, was kidnapped by pirates, was just a lowly nothing. And now her husband had been actually been given the title of the third most powerful admiral in this navy. She was an admiral's wife. She was upper class status. And then here she was at a banquet with the emperor. Certainly she would have been at the VIP table, right? How would she have felt that beyond her wildest dreams when she was younger, that she would be dining with an emperor and with generals? And it must have been a major high point in her life to be in this position. And then the next day she lost it all. The forces were defeated, the pirates dissipated, and we see in the historical record that those same pirates were seen back in Chinese waters about 2 months later. So it was all over with. And so this gave me the basis for a very dramatic and yet very realistic sequence of events. And I asked the professor at the University of Macau, what about all this? I presented him all the information I'd gathered about the pirates in Vietnam. I said, did you know any of this? He said, no. He said, doesn't mean it didn't happen. You discovered something new, Larry. So, something I was very proud of, that I could add to the historical record by putting all these things together that no one had put together before. And it made me more committed to this whole mission of really piecing together this woman's life. And now I've got to skip way forward again. And since I'm going on a long time, let's go ahead to another thing that inspired me, because this was really, in many ways, a local story. And let's keep going here until I get to the right place. So her husband, Cheng Yat, came from a dynasty of pirates that had gone back to the 17th century, who were originally from Fujian province. And as the generations passed, they slowly moved down the coast. And in 1735, I have his name here, a pirate named Cheng Lin Cheng, I don't know what the tones are, I don't know how to pronounce it right. He settled in Le Yumun, which is in eastern Kowloon. And in 1853, he built a Tin Hau temple. This is that temple. And no one tells you that this was built by a pirate. Of course, this temple was rebuilt in the 1950s. I don't know how much of the original structure's there, but it's the same location. That man's eldest son was Cheng Yat. So this was built by Yang's father-in-law, this temple. And then at the same time, the brother of that man, in other words, Cheng Yat's uncle, who was named Cheng Lin Fuk, he settled here, and I wonder if anyone can recognize this. This is a photo taken from on top of a hill looking down on Tung Chung, 1930s. And, 100 years earlier, it probably looked very much the same. This is Check that call. There's no runways there. And it was a very strategic location, as you can imagine. We're in its location in the Pearl River Delta for branching out and hijacking shipping. And with Chetlap Kok there, right in the middle of the bay, it gave a way to escape. If you had attackers come in one side, you'd go out the other. And right here is the village. There was a small village at this fork in this path. And some mud flats and some farms. And many of the descriptions I read about Tongchong of that time in the early 19th century make it look exactly like this picture. So that man's son was Cheng Chat, who was originally the most powerful pirate in the region, first cousin to Cheng Yat. They often went around together. And later in the story, Yang influenced her husband and helped organize a confederation and joined all the pirate gangs of the entire South China Coast into one confederation. And they, whether it was her idea or both of them together, they set up their base in Tongchong. That doesn't mean they were permanently there, but this was the place they would come when they wanted to regroup, clean the ships, or if they would have conferences with the other fleets in the Confederation, they'd come to Tongchong. And so there's no plaques, there's no memorial, there's nothing about that in Tongchong, and no one knows, the very few people even know this part of the history. But this is a fact, and it's documented many, many times, that Tongchong was where the fiercest of the pirates were based. Another place that was important to them was Taiyo. Taiyo, back then, was the same as being up until fairly recently in history. It was a smuggling center. It was a place where the pirates would come and bring in stolen goods and sell them to agents and dealers who would then sell them on up river. Pirates weren't based in Taiyo. They didn't want them there because that would just bring in trouble. But that's where all the agents were. And so Taiyo was conveniently close to Tongchong. And so it was also an important center. And it became an important place for me to go. I don't have a photo for some reason, but I have this kind of quickie sketch I did of a Tinhao temple. If you go into Taiyo, in the central square in the town there's two temples adjacent to each other. The one on the right is a Tinhao temple, which is around 400 years old. And so I'm quite sure that when my pirates came to Taiyo, which they must have done frequently, they would have gone to this temple to pray and give offerings. Tinhao was the goddess of seafarers, and so every ship would have Tinhao shrines and altars, and they built their Tinhao temples, and surely they would have worshipped here. And so I sometimes go there to try to commune with the spirits of these pirates, and I'm not going to say anything further about that. But this in a very long nutshell, I wanted to give you the background of what inspired me to write this story and the kinds of research things I had to go through to come up with the story, connecting all the dots to present a picture of this woman who became such an important part of my life. I just needed to figure her out. And I went through one draft after another, trying to dig deeper and deeper and deeper each time until finally I felt like I was channeling her spirit in this book. And so I believe that what I've come up with is, although it's a novel, it's as close to the truth as I think is plausible about her life. Of course, there could be a totally different version. For me, I didn't write this story in order to create an exciting pirate tale that would sell millions of copies. Right? It was really an exploration of the character of a really incredible woman who left her mark on history. And I hope if you do decide to buy and read the book, that you'll read it with that spirit in mind of trying to explore and understand this incredible woman Cheung Po Tsai. And that's all I have to say. So thank you very much for bearing with me.
Okay, so thank you very much, Larry. And that was very, very interesting. Fantastic. Shall we just ask any questions? Anyone?
Just a quick one. If people want to come in, can
Yeah, people can come in. Yeah, there's a good question. Yeah. Are they pirates? Yeah.
they? They look like it.
Yeah, they look like it, yeah. So I'd like to ask a question anyway, Larry.
Yeah.
I mean, so
Want to come in?
Come in.
a lot of research went into this book. How long did it take you to do the background, put it all together, and then finally finish the book?
I did nothing but research for 5 years before I even started writing a word.
Wow.
I mean, it wasn't full time, 40-hour weeks doing research, but it was in all my spare time. I was gathering information. And it was only after about 5 years I started writing notes and writing some early versions of the opening chapters. But the research continued all along. I mean, when you're doing historical research, it's easy to find yourself going down these rabbit holes and going deeper and deeper and say, oh, that's interesting, and you want to shove it all in.
Yeah.
And so a lot of it was also sorting through the research and figuring out what can I possibly leave out. And so that was also part of it, was doing further research to try to understand how important to the story and to the character things were without losing the essence of the history part.
Yeah.
Are you still digging through that? Are you still doing research, or have you kind of closed that chapter now with the?
Oh no, I'm actually researching a related story. I mean, in fact, this book only tells the first half of her story, her rise. Then there's another half where I've already done the first draft, which tells about the rest of her career as leader of the pirates until there's a really made for movies perfect ending to her story, which ended in a huge battle, and it ended in her making demands on the Chinese government herself. And so that's what the second book is. And I've done all that research. But out of that has come some kind of a side story of a character. I don't even want to talk about it and don't want to jinx it. But there's another side story which also moves to Europe. And that I started doing the research on. And some of it was shut down thanks to COVID. There's a little archive in Macau that has some documents that I really want to get a hold of, and I can't go there, and they won't send them to me. I have to go there in person.
What kind of documents are you using for your primary research? You mentioned something that was translated into German right at the beginning.
No, it was translated into English by a German missionary.
Oh, right.
But, well, I'm finding, so among other things, there's many different things. A lot of it, some of the best things I found were first-hand accounts written by captive British sailors. There was a couple of them who were captured by this same group of pirates, but that'll be in book 2. Well, actually, no, one of them's in book 1.
Yeah.
John Turner is in book 1, and he wrote a bit about his captivity. Not a lot of detail, but at least I learned how many people were with him, how long their captivity was. There was another person who was kidnapped and stayed with them for several months, and he wrote a wonderful detailed account of his captivity with one blessed mention of her. That was such valuable to me that he mentioned her, how she was kind to him and gave him some water. And which was a little bit of insight into her character, right? And then there were a number of accounts written by British commanders in the area who wrote more general things. And then the Portuguese also had written quite a bit. And I've been studying Portuguese. Now I can go back and I can read a lot of those. But some of them I just had to rely on some basic translations.
You mentioned magistrates' records.
Magistrates' records, I didn't really bother with looking those up because they were documented well enough by Diane Murray, the professor who had studied in Taiwan. But she was a big help to me because I wrote to her with hundreds of questions, which she was really kind enough to answer to me. And then she said, you know, instead of answering all these questions, I'm going to get my secretary to copy all these documents. And so she had a stack this high of documents that she'd gotten from a private collection that's held by the British Library that you can't get access to unless you're an academic. And so her secretary ran off copies and sent them to me. And so some of those were Chinese reports, some of them were from, you know, from British Navy archives, and so that was very valuable to me too.
There are more British records than Portuguese about the pirates.
There were. I found more British records. I found Portuguese ones, and it led to some really interesting, kind of almost funny situations. Because, so for example, again, it's not in this book; it's in the second book. But there was a battle in Tung Chung, and it involved some Portuguese ships on the side of the Chinese Navy battling against the pirates. And the Portuguese had written this self-aggrandizing account of that battle, about how these 4 Portuguese ships were of more value in the battle than the 100 Chinese ships, right? Of course. And we won the day and don't believe anything that anyone else says. I mean, they literally say that. Then there's a British account, which is basically, you know, we didn't bother with this battle, but the Portuguese were so incompetent that the Chinese had to come along and save them. And then there's this Chinese document from the 1830s that I mentioned, and I told you his agenda. Well, his agenda, and he says right in there, don't believe what the Portuguese wrote, and don't believe what the British wrote. Here's what really happened. And so it was really funny that I had these 3 accounts. Sometimes they were totally contradictory. But the value in all 3 is that I could then check the dates. So the British used the Gregorian calendar, the Portuguese used the Julian calendar, and the Chinese used the Chinese calendar, and I did all these calculations, and I found that in almost every case the dates matched. So I was able to verify from 3 totally different sources at least certain events. And then, I mean, I literally sat there for days sometimes thinking, which one do I believe? The Portuguese, the British, the Chinese? There's no way to compromise. And so there were certain parts of each of them that I selected as what I considered most likely. Whether or not it made the best story is another matter, but I was looking for what seemed closest to what was plausible to me, along with some supernatural reports that came also from Chinese accounts, which I actually included in this book and also will include in the other one. So a lot of piecing puzzles together where the pieces didn't necessarily all fit together. So yeah, it was very interesting.
In the book you mention an encounter that you had with someone in the hills who told you that she was in a village that was raided by pirates.
I didn't mention that.
1930s. Can you tell us more about
Yeah,
that?
Kathy and I were walking, you know, we often will hike to Tung Chung. And, you know, that trail from Wangtong village to Tung Chung, interestingly enough, was the main artery on Lantau.
Olympic Trail.
No, don't call it that.
Okay. That main trail.
The so-called Olympic Trail was the main artery across Lantau from before they had the roads. And even back in the, you know, the time I'm writing about, that trail was in existence. You can still see some cobblestones that were from there. I don't know how old they are, but some of the original cobblestones are there. So anyway, we were taking that path to Tung Chung, and we'd done it enough times, so we decided we're going to take a little side detour, go down more toward the coast. And we got lost, got totally lost in the woods. And we'd gone down a steep slope, and it was so slippery we couldn't retrace our steps uphill. So we just kept moving through this forest trying to find another path.
The coast on North Lantau?
Yeah, it was on north. It was like 2/3 or 3/4 of the way to Tung Chung. And then we encountered this old woman carrying some baskets and gathering roots and leaves, gathering herbs. And she mentioned that she was gathering herbs to make medicine for her husband. So we got to talking and offered to help her carry her baskets, because she said she'll guide us to the path that'll get us back toward the Tung Chung. And so Kathy asked her age. And I remember she said she was 85 or something like that. And I did a quick calculation. Wait a minute, if she's 85, I don't remember what year that was, maybe 2010, 2012. She would have been, maybe 12 or 13 in the 1930s, when the last big wave of piracy hit this area. There was a lot of pirate attacks and raids. So I asked her, did you see any pirates? And she's like surprised. How does this Guaylo know about that? How do you know? And it turns out the pirates had raided her village. And as I recall, I may be recalling wrong, as I recall, she said that her mother hid her under the stove in the kitchen. And she said she remembers the pirates just pouring into the village and women screaming, they're being pulled out, and some buildings were set on fire, and then they went off.
Do you know which village that was?
I don't remember the name of it.
No.
But she pointed out the village that she lived in that we brought her to was not that one. I remember asking her, is this the village? She said, no, it was down there. And so I thought, oh my God, how lucky I was when I was just starting my research on this, and here I met someone who actually was in a real pirate raid, almost a victim of one. So some of those details that she told me went into the first chapter of this book.
And you had some primary accounts from someone in Tayo as well?
Well, I heard bits and pieces of the story from a guy that we know in Tayo who is, comes from a, past line of fishermen. And he still runs boats. He runs the Gaido that brings equipment from Hong Kong Island to here every day. And I had started, working on this idea, and he recalled a few bits and pieces, and I believe he mentioned something about his grandmother had sung this folk song about a lady pirate who stood up to the government and won. And so there was apparently some folk song in which she was glorified as kind of a folk hero. And then, to my amazement, I found another article someone else who grew up in Tayo had written mentioning this song, but I could never find the words to it. I've searched, even recently I tried again. I've searched everywhere. I've asked so many people. I cannot find the words to the song. But and then he and his family gave me a lot of valuable information about traditional sailing technology and terminology, and a lot of which went into this book.
Can you talk about a little bit in Puyo, the area in Puyo that moved?
Oh yeah, I forgot to mention that in the talk. This is another interesting thing on Lantau. So around that time, this is in that period in the first decade of the 19th century, these pirates were raiding up and down the coast. And Lantau was not immune, even though they were based here. And so there are first-hand accounts of villages that literally moved inland. These houses were made of stone. They literally took apart the houses, moved them inland to get away from the coast, and then built walls around the villages. Puyo is one of them. Shek Pik, the one that is now underwater, was another one. And it's documented. And from a certain angle, if you look down on that field near Ham Tin, you can actually see the shapes of some of the old foundations of the buildings that were there 200 years ago. It's still kind of visible. And in Puyo, in part, I think it's Lo Wai Chun, I was brought there by this historian from the University of Macau. He brought me there. Brought me to this dilapidated stone wall. It's only about this high now. He said, this is the wall. They moved Puyo up to here, and then they built this wall to keep the pirates out. And it's now dilapidated, and there's still that little section. And very few people know what it is. He knew. I don't have a picture of it. I got to go there sometime and take a photo. So again, there's a relic of the piracy of that time still here on Lantau.
Okay, we just need to close down the broadcast now because there's an hour's limit on Facebook, but we can carry on with the questions afterwards. I'd just like to say, Larry, thank you for a very engaging talk today.
Okay, thank you for indulging me as I ramble on.